Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, ma'am. I will be the discussant today, and my topic is the topic 3, which is psychological issues in education. By the way, to personally introduce myself, I am Michi. The topic 3 is psychological issues in education. So these are the desired student learning. A. To state the educational implications of the various researches of different psychologists. B. Use research-based knowledge and principles of teaching and learning to enhance professional practice. And C. Participate in informed discussion of a range of topics in philosophical psychology. So I would like to remind everyone that there will be activities integrated during the discussion. Please prepare a piece of paper with a pencil, crayon, or any pen. We are virtual classmates since the first day, but at least through the online activities, there is still a virtual connection and participation among others. 2 minutes is done. We will identify later on if the word you wrote in your paper relates to the concept or ideas of the educational theories. Multiple intelligences. Teachers are really familiar of this because this is one of the pillars of the educational dream, the fulfillment of the teaching learning process, the multiple intelligences. So from the video that you watched and comprehended, get a statement, one sentence only, from Professor Gardner's interview. Aside from what he explained, may you also give a concrete idea about MI. I will wait for 3 minutes. Explain in 3 sentences only. So 3 minutes starts now. So the next slide is a video interview from the proponent himself, Dr. Howard Gardner. I think that is 7 minutes more or less. So please watch and listen.
We have schools because we hope that someday when children have left schools that they will still be able to use what it is that they've learned. And there is now a massive amount of evidence from all realms of science that unless individuals take a very active role in what it is that they're studying, unless they learn to ask questions, to do things hands-on, to essentially recreate things in their own mind and then transform them as is needed, the, the ideas just disappear. The student may have a good grade on the exam. We may think that he or she is learning, but a year or two later, there's nothing left. If, on the other hand, somebody has carried out an experiment himself or herself, analyzed the data, made a prediction and saw whether it came out correctly, if somebody is doing history and actually does some interviewing himself or herself, oral histories, then reads the documents, listens to it, go back and asks further questions, writes up a paper, that's the kind of thing that's going to adhere. Where if you simply memorize a bunch of names and a bunch of facts and even a bunch of definitions, there's nothing to hold on to. The idea of multiple intelligences comes out of psychology. It's a theory that was developed to document the fact that human beings have very different kinds of intellectual strengths, and that these strengths are very, very important in how kids learn, in how people represent things in their minds, and then how people use them in order to show what it is that they've understood. If we all had exactly the same kind of mind and there was only one kind of intelligence, then we could teach everybody the same thing in the same way and assess them in the same way, and that would be fair. But once we realize that people have very different kinds of minds, different kinds of strengths, some people are good in thinking spatially, some people are good in thinking language, other people are very logical, other people need to do hands-on, they need to actually explore actively and to try things out. Once we realize that, then an education which treats everybody the same way is actually the most unfair education because it picks out one kind of mind, which I call the law professor mind, somebody who's very linguistic and logical, and says, if you think like that, great. If you don't think like that, there's no room in the train for you. If we know that one child has a very spatial or visual spatial way of learning, another child has a very hands-on way of learning, a third child likes to ask deep philosophical questions. A fourth child likes stories. We don't have to talk very fast as a teacher. We can actually provide software, we can provide materials, we can provide resources which present material to a child in a way in which the child will find interesting and will be able to use his or her intelligences productively, and to the extent that the technology is interactive, the child will actually be able to show his or her understanding in a way that's comfortable to the child. We have this myth that the only way to learn something is read it in a textbook or hear a lecture on it, and the only way to show that we've understood something is to take a short answer test or maybe occasionally with an essay question thrown in. But that's nonsense. Everything can be taught in more than one way, and anything that's understood can be shown in more than one way. I don't believe because there are 8 intelligences we have to teach things 8 ways. I think that's silly. But we always ought to be asking ourselves, are we reaching every child? And if not, are there other ways in which we can do it? I think that we teach way too many subjects and we cover way too much material, and the end result is that students have a very superficial knowledge, as we often say, a mile wide and an inch deep, and then once they leave school, almost everything's been forgotten. And I think that school needs to change to have a few priorities and to really go into those priorities very deeply. So let's take the area of science. I actually don't care if a child studies physics or biology or geology or astronomy before he goes to college. There's plenty of time to do that kind of detailed work. I think what's really important is to begin to learn to think scientifically, to understand what a hypothesis is, how to test it out and see whether it's working or not. If it's not working, how to revise your theory about things. That takes time. There's no way you can present that in a week or indeed even in a month. You have to learn about it from doing many different kinds of experiments, seeing when the results are like what you predicted, seeing when they're different, and so on. But if you really focus on science in that kind of way, by the time you go to college, or if you don't go to college, by the time you go to workplace, you'll know the difference between a statement which is simply a matter of opinion or prejudice and one for which there's solid evidence. The most important thing about assessment is knowing what it is that you should be able to do. And the best way for me to think about it is a child learning a sport or a child learning an art form. Because there it's completely unmysterious what you have to be a quarterback or a figure skater or a violin player. You see it, you try it out, you're coached, you know when you're getting better, you know how you're doing compared to other kids. In school, assessment is mystifying. Nobody knows what's going to be on the test, and when the test results go back, neither the teacher nor the student knows what to do. So what I favor is highlighting for kids from the day they walk into school, what are the performances and what are the exhibitions for which they're going to be accountable. Let's get real. Let's look at the kinds of things that we really value in the world. Let's be as explicit as we can. Let's provide feedback to kids from as early as possible, and then let them internalize the feedback so they themselves can say what's going well, what's not going so well. I'm a writer, and initially I had to have a lot of feedback from editors, including a lot of rejections. But over time, I learned what was important. I learned to edit myself, and now the feedback from editors is much less necessary. And I think anybody as an adult knows that as you get to be more expert in things, you don't have to do so much external critiquing. You can do what we call self-assessment. And in school, assessment shouldn't be something that's done to you. It should be something where you are the most active agent. I think for there to be long-standing change in American education that is widespread rather than just on the margins, first of all, people have to see examples of places which are like their own places where the new kind of education really works, where students are learning deeply, where they can exhibit their knowledge publicly, and where everybody who looks at the kids says, that's the kind of kids I want to have. So we need to have enough good examples. Second of all, we need to have the individuals who are involved in education, primarily teachers and administrators, believe in this, really want to do it, and get the kind of help that they need in order to be able to switch, so to speak, from a teacher-centered, let's stuff it into the kid's mind kind of education to one where the preparation is behind the scenes and the child himself or herself is at the center of learning. Third of all, I think we need to have assessment schemes which really convince everybody that this kind of education is working. It does no good to have child-centered learning and then have the same old multiple choice tests which were used 50 or 100 years ago. Finally, I think there has to be a political commitment which says that this is kind of education which we want to have in our country and maybe outside this country for the foreseeable future. And as long as people are busy bashing teachers or saying that we can't try anything new because it might fail, then reform will be stifled as it has been in the past.
For more information.
Let's see now if your answers will coincide to this chart. So this is now the chart of multiple intelligences. So as you can see, there are 8. So that's musical, bodily kinesthetic, interpersonal, verbal linguistic, logical mathematical, naturalistic, intrapersonal, and visual spatial. The next slide will explain to us what are these multiple intelligences. So this is an example of a multiple intelligence index. So from Wizard Academy Foundation Multiple Intelligence Assessment Form. So I got this from one of my seminars way back 2015 or 2014, I'm not sure. So this is this was the preparation of K-12 program before. So there, I tried to answer that one. I tried to identify also my multiple intelligence index. I mean, and I really kept it because I know that I will be using this soon. So there is a 4 for always, 3 frequently, 2 sometimes, 1 seldom, and 0 never. So the next slides, there are 2 more slides after this one. That is a continuation of this paper at the back. I just took a picture of it, and you will see there how to form the grid and identify the different multiple intelligences. So the 2 slides a while back is multiple intelligences and learning styles are from the K-12 program of the Department of Education. So this came from the Reflection on Child-Centered School by Jessie Macabinta Gomez, SDS Trading Program, Antipolo City Rizal. So that's part of the introduction of the what we call here, how can we promote student-centered learning in our basic education program with the K-12 basic education program and the features. So again, the 2 slides a while ago is part of the features of this child-centered school. I'm pretty much sure that you are right in all your answers. It's a piece of cake for teachers. An amused emoji here. Let us now distinguish multiple intelligences to learning styles. If I'm not mistaken, this is one of the considerations that teachers must learn and understand because terminologies are similar but different in textual meaning. I would like to repeat, learning styles focus on visual, auditory, and kinesthetic. However, the next video which you will listen is a study of a contemporary psychologist, and she discussed about what really is learning styles. So after listening, please answer this question for the activity 3. What is your stand about the speaker's substantiated explanation about learning styles?
actually a few different versions, actually many different versions of learning styles, but probably the most common ones, the one that you've heard of, is that some of us are auditory learners, where we learn best by listening to things, and that some of us are more visual learners, where we learn best by seeing things, and that some of us might be more tactile or kinesthetic learners, where we learn best by actually doing things or engaging in physical activities. How many of you have heard of that before? Well, the good news and bad news. Bad news is if you believe in learning styles, you're actually wrong. And I'll explain that in just a minute. But the good news is that it's not entirely your fault. This belief in learning styles is incredibly pervasive. It's so common that few people ever think to even question it, right? It sounds so logical. It sounds so real. But when put to the test, we found that learning styles don't exist. And again, there are tons of people that believe this. When we survey, for example, students and teachers, we find that something like 90% of them, or over 90% of people, believe that they have a learning style. And teachers today, many teachers are still told that part of their job, in order to be effective teachers, is to figure out what their students' learning styles are and then to accommodate them for the classroom. There are even a host of companies and organizations out there that support learning styles and who, for a fee, will train you on how to maximize your potential, or that of your students, right, by addressing learning styles and learning what yours are. But again, the key is when put to the test, these learning styles don't exist, and it doesn't make a difference. Now, I will say that when we survey people, many people say they have preferences. So if I asked you, how would you like to learn something, or how would you like to study? Many of you might say things like, oh, I'd prefer to see it, or I'd prefer to hear it, or I'd prefer to actually do it. So that's true. But the key is that those preferences don't actually enhance your learning when we test them in experimental conditions. And there are many different ways to test this, but the basic design is this. We bring in a bunch of different people who have supposedly different learning styles. We teach them in a variety of ways, right? And then we see if teaching them in one way somehow was better for them or more effective than others. So for example, let's say I had a list of words that I wanted you to memorize, right? In one group, I might show you that list of words. I would present the list of words to you. Or in another group, similarly, I might actually show you images of those words. In yet another group or another condition, I might just let you listen to those words and hear them. So you wouldn't actually see anything, but you would just hear someone saying dog, hose, coat, etc. Now, if learning styles existed, if it was true, we would expect that visual learners, or so-called visual learners, would be able to recall more words when they saw them, right? So either when they saw the list or when they saw the actual images. And we would expect that so-called auditory learners would be able to recall more words when they heard them, right? But again, the finding is learning is actually the same. The number of words that you recall is exactly the same, regardless of how the material is presented to you. Now, I know that's just one example of one particular study, but I'm asking you to trust me that this has been replicated in many different contexts with many different people of all different ages and tested in slightly different ways with exactly the same results. In fact, there have been several meta-analysis papers where they've looked at all the research on this topic for 40 years, and all of them have concluded the same thing, that there's still no evidence that matching teaching styles to supposed learning styles or students' preferences actually makes a difference. But I would encourage you to look up some of this research on your own, in particular these review articles. So then how is that possible? I'm sure some of you are wondering, how does that even make sense, right? Because it sounds so good. And there's a lot of different research on learning and memory to explain this. But one of the main ideas is that most of what we learn in the classroom, and most of what teachers want us to know in particular, is stored in terms of meaning. And it's not tied to one particular sense or one particular sensory mode. Now, it's also true, just like people have preferences, it's also true that some of you might have better visual memories or better auditory memories or auditory processing skills compared to other people. And that might be advantageous for certain types of tasks. So for example, if I wanted you to remember what was the color of the coat on that last slide, or how many windows were on that house on the last slide, then having a really good visual memory would help with that. Likewise, if I had read you the list of words and I said, were they read in a high voice or a low voice? Or which words were read by a woman and which ones were read by a man? Then having a really good auditory memory would help with that. But those aren't typically the kinds of questions that teachers are asking you to remember or the things that teachers want you to learn in the classroom. Mostly what you're learning in the classroom is much more conceptual or meaning-based, right? It's not just what something looks like or what something sounds like. And by the way, this finding or this whole idea also helps to explain why simple rehearsal strategies like rereading your notes or just rewriting your notes, even though they're very commonly used strategies, they tend to not be very effective because rereading your notes or rewriting your notes doesn't necessarily help you understand the material. In order to retain information, right, we have to organize it in a way that's meaningful, right? We have to make connections to it, connecting it to our experiences or coming up with our own examples or thinking of how we're learning something in one class, how that relates to what else we know. That's what helps us remember it. Now, again, there's a lot of research to support this idea that most of what we learn is stored in terms of meaning and not according to visual images or auditory sounds. But some of the best, most relevant research comes from these classic studies that were done in the 70s. Now, Chase and Simon, they were interested in chess players' abilities to recall pictures of chessboard games in progress. So what they would do is they would show players an image of a game in progress for a short time, typically only 5 seconds or so, and then it would disappear. And then they would ask the players to recall where were all the pictures, where were all the pieces in that picture. And what they found was a big difference between novice players or beginner players and experts. Beginner players, when asked to recall where the pieces were, they could only remember about 4 pieces. All right. Experts, on the other hand, could actually identify almost all of them. Over 20 of them could they correctly identify in the next game board when asked to recall these. Now, again, they were interested in knowing, why is this difference? Why do we see this difference between beginners and novices? And it wasn't because, like you might be thinking, that the experts had better visual memories than the beginners. It was because the experts had more experience playing chess and more knowledge. In other words, this game board was more meaningful to them, right? They could see the strategy involved. They could imagine what was happening and why the players had their pieces positioned the way they did. And to further support this idea, they did a follow-up study. And in the follow-up study, they showed chess players pictures of randomly arranged chessboards. All right, and that's this picture here. Now, to you or I, or to beginner chess player, these might look basically the same. I mean, yeah, the pieces are in different places, but for the most part, they might be equally difficult to remember, right? To an expert, though, we found big differences when presented with a randomly configured board. Once it was random, experts no longer had an advantage in remembering pieces because it wasn't meaningful to them. But because there's no meaningful arrangement in this second piece, right, they lost that advantage, which again is just further evidence that we store information in terms of meaning and not according to a sensory mode. And this basic finding, by the way, has been extended to other contexts, everything from chess to basketball to computer programming and to dance. Right? We store information in terms of meaning and not limited to particular sensory modes. So that's the first reason. Another reason why this learning styles theory doesn't pan out is that, the best way to teach something or to learn something really depends on what it is you want to learn, right? Or depends on the content itself. Now, if I wanted you, for example, to know what a bunch of different songbirds looked like, the best way to teach you that is to let you look at pictures of those songbirds or let you see them in real life, right? But note that that's true for everybody. That's not true just because you're a visual learner, right? That's because looking at them is what I'm asking you to do, is to remember what they look like. On the other hand, if I wanted you to remember what they sounded like or to be able to distinguish between different songs of different songbirds, then letting you hear them would be the best way. But again, that applies to everybody. Just like if I wanted you to know what different flowers smelled like, the best way to teach you that is going to be to let you experience those flowers by smelling them. All right, but that doesn't mean you're an olfactory learner or that you learn everything better through smelling. I mean, take a minute to imagine what that would look like in a math class or in an anatomy class, right, or a physics class, right? And as absurd as that sounds, it's really important to remember that the same problems, the same criticisms apply whether we're talking about so-called olfactory learners or whether we're talking about auditory learners or visual learners or even kinesthetic learners. All right, the last 3 might seem more palatable or more reasonable, but the same issues apply. It really depends on what I'm asking you to learn, the best way to teach it. But But that also brings me to another point, and that's this idea that many things can be taught using multiple senses. So it's not just limited to one, for example. So say I wanted you to learn the game of football, right? Probably the best way to teach you football is going to get you out there and play football, right? To actually practice and having that physical experience playing. But you'd also probably benefit from being able to watch a football game or being able to look at schematics or drawings of the different formations and the different positions, just like you'd probably also benefit from hearing coaching or hearing feedback as you're playing. Right? You're getting the kinesthetic experience, the visual, and the auditory. Similarly, if a music teacher wanted you to know the different parts of a symphony orchestra, then yeah, going to an orchestra and listening to one would be beneficial, but it would also add to the experience if you had the capability to touch the instruments, or maybe to learn how to play them, right? Or to actually watch one live. Again, it's not that different modes make it meaningful to different people based on their learning style. It's not like, oh, the visual learners are only going to learn by seeing it. Right? It's because incorporating multiple sensory experiences into one into one lesson makes it more meaningful. So then you might be wondering, why does this myth persist? Right? And there's a few different explanations. And the first one is quite simply that everybody believes it. Right? It's so common that you never even think to question it. Right? How could so many people be wrong? Right? If so many people believe it, how is that possible that it's wrong? But as you know, just because something is commonly believed doesn't necessarily make it true. Remember, just as an example, at one point, we used to think that the Earth was the center of the universe, right? Until scientists like Copernicus and Galileo proved us otherwise, right? Likewise, there was a time in which some people actually believed or were worried that polio might be caused by ice cream, right? Which we now know is nonsense. Right? And unfortunately, even today, one unfortunate myth that still persists is this idea that vaccines cause autism, despite the lack of any scientific evidence. Right? Just because a lot of people believe it doesn't make it true. And that might seem really obvious to you, but again, the key idea is that when something's so pervasive, it doesn't even occur to people to challenge it. Right? We need to be willing to critically reflect on beliefs, even if they're commonly believed. Another reason why this persists is, quite frankly, the idea of learning styles is sexy, right? It sounds good. It feels good, right? Saying people have different learning styles is another way of acknowledging that people are different, and differences are important, right? Especially when it comes to the classroom, right? But me saying that learning styles don't exist, I'm not saying people are the same, right? People do differ in many important ways. Learning styles just isn't one of them. And just because some ideas sound really good, just because we really want something to be true, right, doesn't make it so. We have to remember that, even when we're talking about something as appealing as Santa Claus, unicorns, Bigfoot, or learning styles. And last but not least, another reason why this belief persists is something called confirmation bias. And this is this natural tendency that we have as humans to want to be right. Right? People don't like to be right. Or don't like to be wrong, I should say. So when people have this belief, right, we tend to look for information that fits our beliefs, and we ignore information that doesn't fit our beliefs, right? We don't really very frequently try to prove ourselves wrong, right? More often than not, we try to prove ourselves right. We look for evidence to support whatever it is that we think. And sometimes this is deliberate, right? Sometimes this bias is very deliberate. So you all know that person who deliberately closes their eyes or plugs their ears and says, la, 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 I'm not listening, I don't want to hear that, and turns their back. Right, but more often than not, this is unintentional. This is subconscious. We don't even realize that we're doing it. How many of you, for example, have ever been thinking of someone only to have them call or text you? Or how many of you have experienced deja vu or had a dream only to have it come true, right? And you start to think, whoa, I've got something going on here, right? Some extrasensory perception, telepathic powers, right? Again, I'm sorry to say, you don't, right? That's been studied frequently too, and there's no evidence to suggest that we have these telecommunicative powers to talk to each other, right? But the problem is that we notice every time it happens, right? We notice every time we're thinking of someone and they call us because it's a cool coincidence, right? It's kind of exciting. We notice when we have that moment of deja vu. We don't notice all the times that we're thinking of someone and they don't call us, right? Or we don't really think about all the dreams that we've had that don't come true. Right? It's just like that other common belief that full moons are somehow associated with crazy behavior or increases in emergency room visits. This has also been something that people have scientifically studied. And again, despite common belief, there's no significant correlation there between full moons and emergency room visits. So now you might be wondering, why does it matter? Right? Who cares? So yeah, learning styles don't exist. Hopefully you're buying that by now, right? Yeah, I see why it's still so common though, but who cares, right? Why not believe in learning styles? And I would argue there's at least two important reasons why we need to stop believing this and stop spreading this idea that people have learning styles. The first one is that we're wasting valuable time and resources, valuable educational resources. Teachers already have a momentous task of accommodating students from all different backgrounds, of different ability levels, different disabilities in their classroom, different interests and motivations. That's not easy. All right? The whole fact that learning styles doesn't matter to some extent should be a relief because it's one less thing that teachers have to worry about. All right, but at the very least, we can't afford to be wasting our time and resources trying to promote learning styles when there's no evidence that it actually helps learning, especially when there are research-supported strategies, things that we know we can do that actually do impact learning. So that's the first reason. The second reason is this whole idea that labeling yourself as a learner or labeling a student as a learner can not only be misleading, but it can be dangerous. Right? If I, as a teacher, think that you have a particular learning style or that you only learn in one way, that might prevent me from trying other strategies that could otherwise help you learn the information better. Likewise, if you as a student believe that you have a particular learning style, that could cause you to shut down or lose interest when a teacher isn't teaching in a way that's consistent with your preferred style. Right? And that might actually perpetuate your failure. But it's not because you couldn't learn that way. It's because you gave up and you stopped trying. Right? This whole idea that learning styles don't exist in many ways should be further good news because it means that all of us are capable of learning in a variety of ways. We are not as limited as sometimes we think we are. So in conclusion, when I teach about this topic in my classes, and even when I talk to other professionals and colleagues, first reaction I get is usually a little bit of surprise. Right? Surprise that something that's so common and so ubiquitous isn't actually true. But that's oftentimes followed by a little bit of defensiveness. Right? And I'm sure there are some of you out there right now thinking, okay, I hear what she's saying. Yeah, I don't really care though. I know how I learn. Right? I know that I still have a learning style. People don't like to be wrong. Right? And belief change is really hard, especially when it's a belief that you've held for a really long time or one that's central to your identity. But again, it's really important that we're willing to let our guard down sometimes and to challenge our beliefs and to truly consider other perspectives or different ideas. How often do we get defensive when we hear information or hear ideas that we don't like to hear or that go against our beliefs? How often do we surround ourselves intentionally with like-minded people just so we don't have to face different perspectives? And in a day and age when information is more readily accessible than ever before, how often do our Google searches take us to showmeimright.com rather than unbiased evidence? Thank you.